Chapter 30, Lesson 3, The Home Front and Civilians. During World War II, nations mobilized their people and geared their economies for war. While the troops fought, the citizens on the home front made personal sacrifices to produce the materials and supplies needed to fuel the war. Hundreds of thousands lost their lives in bombing raids. So today we're going to talk about what was going on at home for the countries that were involved in World War II, as well as the practice of civilian bombing. So during World War I, we talked about what the concept of a total war is, and that World War I was a total war. World War II was even more so a total war. In fact, most people would use World War II as an example of what a total war is. The fighting was more widespread across the globe. The economic mobilization was more extensive. Economic mobilization is when your factory converts into something that's needed for the military. So let's say you've got a factory that produces cars. Well, now the factory is producing tanks. Let's say you've got another factory over there that produces weapons. Let's say originally they manufactured refrigerators. Well, now they make guns. Or all these factories that used to make normal everyday things are now making things for the military. The roles for women during World War II were even greater than they had been in World War I, and unfortunately even more civilians were killed than in World War I. In World War I, sometimes civilians were killed as just sort of a side effect of war. In World War II, what we're going to talk about is civilians being killed on purpose. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish the notes. So first we're going to talk about the home front of the Soviet Union. Some of the greatest land battles in world history took place in the Soviet Union during World War II. The city of Leningrad was under siege for 900 days. We also saw the same thing with Stalingrad in a previous lecture. People were so desperate for food, because their city was completely surrounded by Nazis, that people ate dogs and cats and mice, and 1.5 million people died. And this was not just military personnel. These were the regular people who lived in these cities. Something really amazing as part of the total war effort that the Soviet Union did, this was actually Joseph Stalin's idea, was, okay, so when we talked in class, we've looked at the big world map on the wall. We talked about how big Russia is. That even though it's so big, most people lived in a small area of Western Russia, which is part of Eastern Europe. During World War II, they dismantled their factories and moved them into the interior, like into the middle part of the country, to get them farther away from the Nazis. This was a really super cool move. To quote, "Machines were placed on the bare ground. As laborers began their work, walls went up around them." To dismantle your factories and move them and put them somewhere else to keep your production going, man, it blows my mind how cool that is of the Soviet Union. Another really cool thing they did is they allowed women to fight in the military. Not just, cooking for the military or building weapons in factories. They actually let women serve. And there were actually a lot of them who were trained as snipers on the ground and from planes. There's a lot of badass Soviet women who got really good at killing Nazis. Go ahead and pause here if you need a moment to finish the notes. All right. World War II in the United States. So because all the other countries in World War II were, under siege and had battles going on, The United States kind of became the arsenal for the Allies. There was no fighting in the mainland United. Yes, Hawaii had been bombed, but mainland USA was at peace during this wartime. So most of the weapons and tanks and ships and everything were being built here in the United States. 16 million American men and women enrolled in the military, which left 16 million people looking for jobs, mostly women, because all the men were going to war. And something that's unique about World War II is during World War II, men wanted to go to war. Everyone, it was an act of patriotism. It was an act of fighting evil. Um, partly because it was expected of men, but they weren't just doing it because it was expected of them or because their manhood would be insulted if they didn't go. Most men wanted to go and stand up for what was right. In fact, Major League Baseball shut down. Well, it didn't shut down. It was women replaced the men. There's a really good movie about it, A League of Their Own. If you haven't seen A League of Their Own yet, I highly recommend it to see all the women playing professional baseball. But like Joe DiMaggio, super famous baseball player, he quit Major League Baseball to serve his country in World War II. A lot of celebrities and famous people were taking part of the war effort. Our whole country, went to war during World War II. But socially, things that were affecting us and changing our society is so for hundreds of years, African Americans have lived in the South, which is where their ancestors had been enslaved. They started really migrating after World War One, during the Great Depression, and now into World War II. African Americans are migrating even more into the North in Chicago and New York, and to the West in cities like Los Angeles. This changed our country socially because these are places African Americans hadn't really lived in before, and it created some tension with the white people who were already living there. And there was rioting, there was protests. This is kind of starting to lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that's going to come in the 1960s. Military-wise, during World War II, blacks were allowed to serve in the military, but they were in segregated units. They were not allowed to serve alongside white people in the Army. This picture on the top left is of the infamous Tuskegee Airmen. They were a very famous combat pilot unit that comprised all African American men who did an amazing job serving their country in World War II. Another thing we need to look at and talk about, a dark mark in American history, is what they did to the Japanese Americans during World War II. In California, they placed Japanese Americans in internment camps, the same way Hitler put Jews in internment camps. Now, the American ones were not, meant for people to die, but still, how do you take people based on their race and put them in a camp and take them out of their homes? There was a concern, the US government was concerned that these people might be spies for the Japanese. Now, these are not people who just arrived from Japan yesterday. These are people who were born here and were American citizens, and yet their civil rights were violated and they were placed into these camps. It's an ugly, disgusting thing that the United States government did. But, we talk about World War II, there's a lot of ugly and disgusting things we have to talk about. Go ahead and pause here if you need more time to finish these notes. All right, the home front in Germany. So for Hitler, it was really important to keep the German people happy at home. He wanted to keep the morale high. He wanted them to feel like everything was going great. Because he feels like part of the reason Germany lost World War I is because they lost the support at home. Morale for the war during World War I was not very high. But people didn't know what they were fighting for in World War I. So it was important to him to keep people feeling like things were normal. So He wanted them to be able to go to the grocery store and all the groceries they needed would be there, or whatever shopping you needed to do, you'd be able to go get it. So, like the Allies and even Japan did that. All the other countries had turned their economies into a wartime economy. So when you turn that um, car factory into a tank factory, you're not really producing cars anymore. There's not so many cars to buy. When you turn that refrigerator factory into a gun factory, there aren't as many refrigerators to buy. You lose consumer goods when you transition into a wartime economy. In fact, in America, we had ration tickets. You were only allowed to buy so much of this and so much of that because we were only producing so much of this and so much of that. Most of everything was going towards the war. And the country understood this, and everyone really united together and were willing to sacrifice. There's the Rosie the Riveter poster. We can do it. There was this really beautiful bonding that happened in America during World War II. We're in this together. We can give some things up to help the boys, fighting the Nazis. Hitler didn't want to do that in his society. He wanted everything to stay normal. He wanted people to feel a sense of normalcy. So this is actually one of the mistakes he made that would end up leading to his loss of the war. He also felt that women should not be working outside the home. By the time he realized he needed a wartime economy and he transitioned into a total war economy, it was really just too late for him. Another thing I want you guys to understand is Hitler made a lot of mistakes. That World War II was won, or he was defeated more so based off exposing his mistakes and taking advantage of mistakes more so than it was, oh, the Allied powers are so great. It's actually frightening to know that if Hitler had been a little bit smarter, a little less selfish, and made less mistakes, he absolutely would have won this war. He almost did several times. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish this slide. All right, Japan. So Japan was highly mobilized. They probably had the most total war society out of everyone in World War II. They had a planning board that controlled everything: the prices, the wages, the labor, the resources. Japan was also used to, part of their culture is having habits of obedience and hierarchy. You are to obey your elders. You are to obey the men in your family. You are to honor the emperor. Honor is a big part of their society as well. So because of, their long traditions in Japan, it was easy for them to turn into a wartime society and do what they're told. Young Japanese men were highly exploited by this idea of honor, I think. They were recruited to be what we call kamikazes. They were pilots who were assigned to go on suicide missions, to crash their plane into the target instead of dropping bombs. So whether it was, crash your plane into a boat, crash your plane into an airfield, crash your plane into a building, these men were sent on suicide missions, and they were told that, it was an honor to die for their emperor. Women were not allowed to work in Japanese society. They instead, so Japan was occupying pretty much all of the South Pacific at this time. So they took men from the countries they had occupied in China and Korea and brought these men and forced them to work in their factories to keep their war machine going. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish the notes for this slide. All right, so we've gone through what was happening on the home fronts of some of these nations. Now we're going to talk about the bombing of cities and the role each of these nations decided to play in the bombing of civilians. The first time civilians were bombed on purpose was when Germany bombed London in September of 1940. This is the Battle of Britain. For months, the Germans bombed the city nightly. The German air raids were called the Blitz. Eventually, other English cities ended up being bombed too. Many people were evacuating their children with their mothers into the countryside because the cities had become targets. A lot of people tried to send their children to the United States and Canada for safety. But even so, that even wasn't always safe. There was an ocean liner that was sunk by a German torpedo, and 77 British children drowned and never made it to safety in Canada. Go ahead and pause here if you need a moment to finish these notes. Well, the British definitely got their revenge on Germany. So Hitler was bombing civilians because he thought that it would break their morale. But it had the opposite effect. It just made them hate him more. And they didn't even though it didn't break their morale, they thought, well, if we bomb German civilians, then that'll break their morale. Didn't work on them, but they thought it would work on Germany. So the British started doing the same thing and attacking civilians in Germany. The Germans also sent children to the countryside. What ended up happening in Germany is so many bombs were dropped in an area that it created a firestorm. And the firestorm ends up, the fire spreads in such a way that like the entire city goes up in flames. It's an absolutely horrible, dangerous phenomenon. 35,000 people were killed in Dresden from a firestorm that happened after the city was bombed. German production was up in despite of the bombing, but it made it difficult for their supplies to get their troops because the supply lines were being bombed. So even though they were making a lot of supplies, they were having a hard time getting it out to the troops because the British were bombing the railway, the tracks and bridges that the trains and trucks would have needed to reach the German troops. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish the slide. And lastly, we're going to talk about America and bombing of Japanese cities. The first time we bombed Tokyo was shortly after Pearl Harbor. Towards the end of the war, Japan was exposed to air raids because their air force had pretty much been completely destroyed. We started using B-29 superfortresses to bomb Japan in 1944. So during the course of the war, the United States had been working on what was called the Manhattan Project. They had been working on developing a nuclear bomb. They tested it out here in the deserts of New Mexico. It was a top secret plan. And it came to the point where our leaders of America needed to decide, because we had decided, we'd promised that we would unconditional surrender is all we were going to take. So to get Japan to unconditionally surrender, we had to decide, did we want to send ground force troops in to take over Japan the old-fashioned way and lose American lives, or did we want to drop atomic bombs on them? So the decision was made to drop 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were cities. This was bombing of civilians. These were not military targets. So in 1945, the United States dropped nuclear weapons on Japan to avoid a land invasion. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish the slide. This is the end of the lecture on the home front and the bombing of civilians.